Now I'm going to read the third part of the paper. You Can't Go Home No More. Africans in America in the Age of Globalization. The paper became a chapter 2, in the book that I co-edited with Olufemi Vaughan, titled West African Migrations, Transnational and Global Pathways in a New Century. It was published by Palgrave Macmillan in 2012. So this section deals with what I consider to be the conceptualization of diaspora. And then if one is saying that one belongs to a community, how do I see that? So there's an old and new diaspora. So I'll talk here first about the African diaspora, old and new. What then does diaspora mean to me? Off the top of my head, the word recalls a scattering, a forced dispersal, exile. It is also a painful proposition because I think of the biblical Israelites and Babylon, and often recall their experiences. I also think about the Melodians, a musical group, and later the group Boney M and the Rastafarians. As I researched the paper in the early 2000s, I also found out that Lord Byron was actually inspired to write a poem about the rivers of Babylon earlier in 1815. But let's remember the biblical Israelites' experience of diaspora preceded this. So Babylon could be taken as defining my presence in North America. A presence that was supposed to be 5 years long, but is now 42 years. And once we get into the new year, it would be 43 years. However, in order to assert such a relationship, some explication is necessary. So, first popularized by the Jewish experience, it is especially appropriate to the forcible snatching away of Africans from the continent into the maws of the slave economy in one of the previous iterations of globalization. The Jewish experience actually gives one a poignant rendition of the Babylon experience as full of pain, alienation, dis-ease, and depression. The question of how one sings the Lord's song in a strange land is significant. Does this apply to the new African migrants of today's newly minted globalization? Whether or not one thinks so depends on whether we believe that there is any volition to the move from Africa to other parts of the world. Some, of course, is volitional. Some people who move are desired, they're courted, they're recruited. For others, however, their movement is absolutely driven by compulsion. And these are the Africans that we find in the miserable hellholes of human existence that is also part of the global experience. Whether it's the old or the new variety, African diasporas were propelled by the capitalist ingenuity that makes the profit motive more important than all else. African heads are also knocked together in the cosmopolitan metropolis of today's world by capitalist chains of demand and supply, this time and in the past for labor. So now to community claims. I will once again talk about my Yoruba-colored perspective of the world. The Yoruba say, "Ènìyàn láṣọ mi." People are my clothing. I am nothing without my people. My people are my wealth. They also say, "Àgbájọ ọwọ́ la fi ń sọ̀yà." One uses the entire palm to beat the chest. Unity is central to the human experience. Ọwọ́ kan ò lè gbẹ́rù dórí. One hand cannot heft a load onto the head. Ọmọdé gbọ́n, àgbà gbọ́n la fi kọ́ Ilé Ifẹ̀. The wisdom of the young and old contributed to the founding and development of Ilé Ifẹ̀, which is regarded as the spiritual home of the Yoruba. Although, quote, blood is thicker than water, unquote, in all reality, one is not related to all of one's family by blood, the way Yorubas think about it. There's also fictive kinship, which makes relatives of long-term friends and old-time residents of Yoruba Agboile or the family compound. Then this notion of family is reawakened in the diaspora when the children of African immigrants call their parents friends, aunts, and uncles, and the children of those relatives. When the children of African immigrants call their parents friends, aunts, and uncles, and the children of those relatives cousins. This is not too unfamiliar to African Americans and other Africans of the diaspora. The institutionalization of chattel slavery meant that one had to create family however one could, and the gross exploitation and deliberate destruction of family units meant that people had to adapt to the fluidity of kinship. This, of course, differs from the kind of kinship that emerges in communities that could exercise more choice over their family arrangements. But do not let us forget that Africans in Africa also waged wars against one another, and these wars intensified in the days of the transatlantic slave trade, helped along by Europeans who wanted to increase the supply of captives, the product of which was the ripping apart of families when some were taken into captivity. As I write this, another Yoruba saying comes to mind, "Bopetiti eru adomo." It's only a matter of time before a slave becomes king. This speaks to the ideal that people were not supposed to be slaves forever and could become fictive kin. The idea I'm trying to convey is that Yoruba families are fluid and permeable. Communities are not immutable and can be built wherever the goodwill and philosophical commitments exist. I suggest that this opens up the possibility of constructing diasporan communities based on fictive kinship that can engage in progressive identity politics based on Pan-Africanist ideals. Further, Africans can't go home no more because home is not an unchanging, immutable, and fixed place, but rather is in motion, constantly changing, and may seem unfamiliar or worse still, strange to the sojourner. However, it tugs at the heartstrings, and a refusal to embrace it is even more dangerous to the psyche than the dis-ease that comes from encountering an unfamiliar, changed home. In terms of the political realities faced by Africa, Africans, and the African diaspora, the embrace of Africa as home is even inevitable. Africa today is mired in deep economic crisis. Its politics has many troubling characteristics and manifestations, whether one looks at Zimbabwe or Kenya or Sudan or Nigeria or any number of African countries. As Africans in the old and new diaspora, it is incumbent on us to mobilize in the first place, to help ourselves. And as we do that, to simultaneously mobilize and form coalitions to devise solutions for African problems. This being said, there are many impediments to the kind of common cause that I recommend. History, particularly as pertaining to imperialism and colonialism, stand in the way. Bad blood arising from the puzzlement of being given up by one's family into captivity that became chattel slavery in the New World economy, and the refusal to discuss the consequent injuries and animosities stand in the way. Miseducation stands in the way. While in sojourn, I have observed the relentless movement of time, the progression of technological innovation, particularly the emergence of new information technologies and the possibilities that they open up for communication, building community, developing and nurturing new networks. The World Wide Web has provided a lifeline that reduced my own isolation from home. And from discourses of and about home. I have thus become a willing participant in and observer of online discussions on and about Africa. Some of the virtual discussion groups I belong to always provides food for thought. Some of them are very disquieting, though. I participated in some of these discussions in the past by contributing relevant papers as well as comments, but have now chosen to take on observer status, staying out of the fray to avoid futile and acrimonious debate that remind me of my fiery youth and the vanity of engaging in such fruitless discourse. However, these discussion groups constantly remind me of home, particularly by bringing attention to challenges that continue to militate against economic and political development. They constantly also remind me that I may never be able to go home ever again. The ground has shifted too much. They also make me wonder, can I return? Inspired by the Yoruba adage, "Àtẹ́lẹwọ́ ẹni la fi ń tún ìwà ara ẹni ṣe." One rehabilitates one character with one's own hands, or the solution for one's problems lie in one's hands. This chapter argues that while there are numerous challenges that militate against the development of a cohesive Pan-African front among people of African descent, there are also some positive aspects of African culture, particularly in the ideals of philanthropy and community building that we can build on and accentuate to help us face the challenges of the future, beginning with the 21st century. These ideals include collective self-help, generosity, informal networking, and mentorship, and a selfless interest in the welfare of others. How can these ideals serve as an inspiration in personal, professional, community, and political life? And how they can facilitate connections with other people of African descent to solve common problems now and in the future? We'll have to figure this out. As a sojourner in North America, who constantly deals with the nostalgia of a lost and elusive home, I remain guided by Yoruba philosophies of philanthropy. And in maintaining connectedness with home, these are a few of the factors that inspire me. They have stood me in good stead in my professional and personal life. Through hearkening to these axioms, I have helped others. And by so doing, helped myself even more. I know that there are many others just like me that have done the same. And it is this that gives me hope in such a hostile world that is so eager to dismiss Africa and Africans as marginal. These axioms are meaningful to me and ground my belief that they should be meaningful and relevant to serious engagement with philanthropy and activism in order to contribute to making solutions to some of the problems that I observe. I also see what I do as contributing to Pan-African women's philanthropy. Whether or not one takes a cursory or concentrated look at the African continent and its diaspora today, one encounters significant need. Some have chosen to define the need as one for leadership. If there were only good leaders, one hears, there would be a better Africa, a better community, a better state of well-being, a better state of material existence. Most of these analysts don't necessarily believe that the leaders needed are African women, except in countries devastated by destructive war, genocide, apartheid. Rwanda has the most women in the world as a percentage of its national legislature. South Africa has met and exceeded the Millennium Development Goals of 30% women in the national legislature. And Liberia had Ellen Johnson Sirleaf. There are other African countries that have met and exceeded the MDGs, or Millennium Development Goal, of 30% women in national legislature. In some, there's even parity between men and women. This is sufficient for many to rest on their oars, erroneously believing that the high visibility of such women in positions of power means that there will automatically be better life for all. Women, after all, this is a joke, are from Venus and men from Mars. Women are thrifty and can make something out of nothing, etc., etc. But these platitudes should not be consumed in an uncomplicated manner. I've said this in other papers. While we celebrate the achievements of the powerful women who have excelled in African politics, and indeed of us all, we cannot and should not engage in empty triumphalism. Basically because Africa is a continent in crisis, a crisis that developed over many centuries, a crisis that spewed most of us here forth into other hostile lands with only degrees of volition. While from the 17th to the 19th centuries, some of our ancestors were frog-marched in chains out of the continent, in the 20th and 21st centuries, most of us were hounded out by punitive authoritarian governments and their draconian policies or actual civil wars. Many today, especially the disillusioned youth, are still pouring out of the continent by any means necessary, fleeing as much from hunger and economic dead ends as from political upheaval and wars. And yet, Africa is richly blessed with natural and human resources, including significant intellectual capacity and technocratic skills and experience. This is where our first axiom comes in. Oweni lafintun iware nishe. We must use our own hands to rehabilitate our character. Africans have been maligned by the powerful actors in the world's political economy for too long. The same actors, predominantly located in Western Europe and North America, are responsible for exploiting Africa and its peoples, and the very same are responsible for the rape of Africa, the enslavement of its people, and its colonization. Yesterday's imperialistic powers are still very much around today. And paradoxically, many African countries and African peoples would rather trust them than depend on other Africans who are not from their lineage, clan, ethnic group, country, or from their continent and its old and new diasporas. One does not have to be a diviner to realize that Africans cannot afford the luxury of the divisions that still militate against our success in this world. Pan-Africanism was suggested as a viable solution to the problems of Africa and African peoples wherever they are, as a viable solution to the problems of Africa and African peoples wherever they are. Its promise remains unfulfilled. And this lack of fulfillment is responsible for our predicament as Africans in the world today. No one else has more at stake as Africans, wherever they may be located in the development of the continent. Development not in the skewed manner that currently exists, but in a manner that extends economic and political well-being to the majority of our people. A belief in Oweni lafintun iware nishe means that with the understanding that one would use one's own hand to correct one's reputation or fate or problems, also means that this is a call for unity in our diversity. For I know that you all know that Africa is the most diverse continent in the world. The diversity of its peoples has also been compounded by the diasporic experiences of old and the ongoing diasporization of its peoples. One of the indicators of that diversity is what we all know from the US Census Bureau, which tells us that Minneapolis has the second highest proportion of Africans among its foreign-born population after Columbus, Ohio. We also see a lot of diverse populations of African-born immigrants growing in the United States and in other global North locations. Unity in relation to philanthropy means that there should be the formation of both scholarly and popular epistemic communities around the question of philanthropy. Epistemic communities are simply stated communities of knowledge. They are commonly believed to be restricted to highly educated, usually male-dominant groups of experts that are drawn together by their common interests in one given subject matter and shared expertise in this area, plus their recognition as experts by governments, think tanks, the media, and the like. What makes ordinary people particularly non-expert, I ask? The belief by the world's powerful actors that they are not is the only thing that makes them non-expert. However, the contribution of the non-governmental organizations to the world's knowledge base is that ordinary people can develop an expertise and agitate for positive change in the issue areas around which they choose to organize for the purpose of making change. While actualizing Owen Lafin Tuniwara Inishi, we also remember that Agbajo Lafin Soya. One uses one's entire hand when you touch your palm to the chest to assert your name or utter the word me. The underlying meaning of this proverb is that unity is crucial to success. The Yoruba also say, "Ẹnìkan kìí jẹ́ àwádé." One person cannot possibly be named or assert, "We have arrived." One person, that is, does not make a community. Therefore, we owe it to ourselves to unite in order to challenge, erode, and destroy the structures of domination that tell us Africans that we cannot be the source of knowledge, particularly the highly specialized knowledge required to solve our own problems. Africans have to use their entire hand, or all the branches of the African peoples that are scattered throughout the diaspora in the first place to assert an African identity. And then in unity to focus on solving the myriad of problems that we face. How can we unite when we have such painful histories in our past and present? The history and legacy of slavery hangs like an albatross around our necks, and many of us cannot bear to discuss this painful history, even with those we love. And a discussion is out of the question, particularly with those we have learned to fear and or distrust, and those for whom we have no respect, based on the misinformation and miseducation a la Carter Woodson. From the educational systems in both Africa and the diaspora that have colonized African minds, according to Ngugi wa Thiong'o, the Kenyan scholar who has been exiled in the United States for many decades and whose recent home was incidentally traumatizing. in the sense that his wife was brutally raped. In such a case, not only is it apposite to invoke Lou Rawls and say that you can't go home no more. You can't go home no more. The past is dead, dead and gone. They pulled down the house where you were born. You can't go home no more. Okay, now, what does it mean? What does home mean to one who received such a violent welcome? Does one want to? And can one return home anymore? Even more problematic is the fact that all of us know that there will be no significant movement forward if we don't discuss the enslavement of African peoples, first by other Africans, and then by European business interests that wanted unpaid labor to generate wealth in the new world they had, quote unquote, discovered, whose indigenous people they had well nigh eliminated through genocidal policies in their imperialistic drive to acquire land, extract natural resources, and create new colonies peopled by their own people, but worked by others wherever they could be found. With Native Americans wiped out, Africa, which was known to be rich in human resources, was their next logical, quote unquote, terra nullius, or no man's land, so defined in order to legitimize its rape and plunder. The most annoying and tragic factor for most people of African descent in the continent's old diaspora is the extent of African participation in the slave trade. And while this is a fact, it is not as unproblematic as historians have demonstrated. However, this neither speaks to the pain nor acknowledges the sense of betrayal and despair that those that were ripped away from the bosom of kith and kin and cast out to the vagaries of a cruel world in which they were treated as no more than merchandise and property, chattel slavery. No amount of rationalization and explanation and analysis can assuage the pain of feeling that your own people abandoned you. No explanations of the divisions, competition, use of devious and divisive strategies by Europeans can convince a people tossed into the maws of European greed and imperialistic drive to corner the world's wealth that their own people were complicit in ensuring their dehumanization. It does still hurt, they know, that their own people come from the old continent and succumb so easily to the divide and conquer strategies of racist power structures and depend for their information on ignorant but slick media strategies that present African Americans in the worst possible light, forgetting in a display of extreme naivety that the African continent and by extension themselves are painted with the same brush when the pathologized image, conceptualization, and analysis of Africa and Africans is trotted out time and again. There's a need for a coming together to have frank discussions on our problematic past. And nothing concrete and significant can be achieved without this. As the Yorubas say, if two siblings go into a room to have a frank discussion about a problem and they come out smiling. They are not being honest with one another. If our discussions with one another are frank, we would not be cordial with one another as we undertake the discussion. Ọmọdé gbọ́n, àgbà gbọ́n la fi kọ́ Ilé Ifẹ̀ is especially relevant because although we have to give experts their due, they may well possess specialized knowledge that it takes many years and big bucks at some of the world's most prestigious universities to learn. Not to talk of sleepless and restless nights in isolation trying to figure out the big questions. I also want to urge us not to only look to experts to solve the problems, not least because there are also small questions that must be figured out, but also because ordinary people can develop enough expertise to give innovative answers to even the big questions, but only to the extent that they are also ready to work night and day, but not to the point of being burnt out. They must learn to ask for help, to network, to build coalitions and institutions. Now, for philanthropy to be meaningful for me, the axiom that Ile Latin Kesho Rude is particularly important. Charity begins at home, and thus one must help oneself and those that are closer to you first before venturing abroad to help others. I began by talking about shared material conditions by African peoples. Nothing brings this into sharper focus at the time, 2010, than New Orleans, where centuries of prejudice against Blacks and privilege for whites colluded to produce a humanitarian disaster of massive proportions, the kind that one observes impacting on the lives of internally displaced peoples and survivors of natural disasters, pandemics like HIV, AIDS, political conflict and war. And more recently, let's think about the Black Lives Matter protests after the killing of George Floyd and a lot of the other, brutal killings of people of African descent. Let us think about the ways in which white supremacy and racism still torments people of African descent. Let us think about more recent pandemics like the COVID-19 one that in North America and the UK disproportionately affected people of color. So, how does it work for a community? Ọwọ́ ẹni la fi ń tún ìwà ẹni ṣe implies collective self-help to create new and positive discourses, to replace old negative stereotypes and discourses about Africa and Africans. It is crucial that strong, durable, philanthropic institutions be created to enable Africans engage in collective self-help. This demonstrates to a skeptical world that Africans can help themselves, but is not done for the benefit of the outside world. It is done to help Africans. The more the institutions, the better. Since the need is so great and the terrain is so huge. Ojú ọ̀run tẹyẹ fò láì fàpagunra wọn. The skies are big enough for birds to fly without colliding with one another. This means that, if well designed, Each and every organization can coexist and fulfill its mandate without being threatening to others. Each of us can take that area of need that we feel most passionate about and meet those needs without looking over our shoulders and without considering others as invading our turf. For example, the problem of HIV/AIDS is so huge that all philanthropic organizations represented in the world can focus on it without the problem of overserving those whose health have been assaulted by the disease, those whose family members have been killed prematurely by it, those orphaned, widowed, childless, sisterless, brotherless, familyless as a result of the scourge. Same goes for any affliction. Let me hasten to say that there may be problems with geographical and spatial over-concentration of institutions in some areas. And where this occurs, the problem could be easily corrected if there's a spirit of cooperation and collaboration, rather than one of destructive competition that is energy-sapping and unedifying. Ọmọdé gbọ́n àgbà gbọ́n la fi kọ́ Ilé Ifẹ̀. No one is all wise. No one has all the answers. No one can solve all the problems. Shared knowledge and a belief that one can learn from both young and old, both women and men, from our friends and those we do not necessarily like so much, means that we take seriously the business of our own empowerment, and we are generous enough to validate others who may be younger, poorer, not as well connected as ourselves, by consulting with them, inviting them to deliberate with us, bringing them to the table, listening to them, and being open to learning from them and being inspired by them, just as we hope that they'll be inspired by us when we share our gems of wisdom. Àgbájọ ọwọ́ la fi ń sọ̀yà implies that we should build coalitions to better face adversity and solve common problems. The experience of imperialism and enslavement and colonization that it brought with it has left Africans scattered and divided. The hope that Pan-Africanism presents is that such division need not be forever. Africa for Africans means that people of African descent must consciously cross and break down many of the barriers to our unity and work collaboratively to solve our problems both here and there. Note that here in this case for me is the United States of America, and there is Africa and its diaspora, which means I'm not excluding the African diaspora here in the US from the ranks of Africans that might need help and or philanthropy. If we can in good faith call upon multinational corporations to practice socially conscious investment in the African continent, we can also in good faith call upon the new African diaspora to give back in their communities of settlement, beginning with their kinfolk, African Americans, African Caribbean peoples, African Latino peoples. Mutual and collective self-help enriches and edifies us all. Ilé Latin Keshorode implies a focus on the local first and the global thereafter. If one does not help one's needy kinfolk to gain self-sufficiency, how can one in good faith help others? Remember that when I talk about kinfolk, I believe and encourage you to join me in the belief that all peoples of African descent are related and must take the approach that we must engage in mutual and collective self-reliance for the massive problems that we confront to be solved. Also, this is a process. And since our problems did not develop in a brief period of time, they will not be solved in one fell swoop. Ọmọdé gbọ́n àgbà gbọ́n la fi kọ́ Ilé Ifẹ̀. exhorts us not to be dismissive of anyone's contributions and reminds us that we all have the capacity for wisdom. Finally, the Yoruba have a concept of Ori, which literally translates into the head, but really means the essence of a human being. The Ori is a powerful force that affects and shapes human fate. Orí la fi ń mú ẹran láwo tí a kò fi ń mú egungun. It is one's head that influences one's success or failure. Literally, it is the head that motivates one to pick the meat rather than the bone from a plate of food. This can be translated to mean that there's a fatalistic belief in predestination. And so, why try? But remember that this same Yoruba tell us like that àtẹ́lẹwọ́ ẹni la fi ń tún ìwà ara ẹni ṣe. And words have multiple layered meanings that can be peeled as with an onion. The wiser one becomes, the better one can discern the hidden meaning in words. The Ori also gives us our imagination, our creativity, our special characteristics, those things that make us unique and special. Thus, the Ori can be worked upon with the Owo to produce a transformation from catastrophe to well-being, provided one seeks help when it's necessary, provided one is willing to keep an open mind and be willing to learn from others, and provided that one is not averse to the challenge of doing the heavy lifting required to make positive change. I dare say that our history has literally thrown down the gauntlet. The catastrophes that we behold are a challenge, and with unity, openness to learning from both young and old, with a commitment to unearthing and rehabilitating our history, a burning desire to form both popular and scholarly epistemic communities, and to use the communities to increase the knowledge pool of the world, particularly with the intention of solving African problems first and the world's problems next. Africa will emerge from the margins and take a central position in world affairs. Africa will soar like a phoenix and shine like the sun. Africa will glow like a star-studded sky. We are all in the struggle. Let's neither rest on our oars or be discouraged, and victory will be ours. Thank you very much. This concludes the paper and the book chapter that it became. Thank you.